More than 30 years ago, world leaders came together to solve the climate change problem. George H.W. Bush had just been sworn in as president after campaigning as an environmentalist dedicated to tackling the global warming issue. But despite all this momentum, Bush's administration failed to act. I wanted to learn more, so I reached out to author Nathaniel, who told this story in his excellent New York Times article and follow-up book, Losing Earth: The Decade We Could Have Stopped Climate Change.
That is the closest we've come to any kind of serious binding global treaty. And very shortly thereafter, that kind of agreement comes to seem totally impossible.
In this episode, we'll hear about how the entire US government came to fully understand the need to limit greenhouse gas emissions, but didn't get the job done. We'll hear from the man who has worked for decades to put climate change on the agenda.
In my early interviews, everyone I spoke to said, well, yes, I was involved in this such and such a way, but you should really talk to Rafe. I met with him on a reporting trip to DC, and within a few minutes, I realized that he was the key to the story, that he in fact was the only climate activist between 1979 and 1989, just about.
Rafe Pomerance was a young activist working with the environmental organization Friends of the Earth.
I read a report done by the Environmental Protection Agency on the environmental impacts of coal. And in that report was a sentence or two about the fact that coal use might lead to a warmer planet through the emissions of CO2. Just that simple. I said to myself, this can't be. I handed the study to a colleague of mine, Betsy Hagel. Betsy came back a couple of days later with an article from a newspaper called the Rocky Mountain News, with a story about a scientist, Gordon MacDonald, who had just given a speech about the problem.
MacDonald was a Jason. The Jasons are an elite group of researchers that advise the US government on sensitive, high-priority matters of science and technology. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, MacDonald studied how fossil fuel burning would change the climate. His models convinced him that human activity would lead to dangerous global warming, so he began issuing public warnings in speeches and articles, which is what eventually caught Rafe's attention.
Went out to see him. I said, if I set up the briefings, will you do them? The key to our work is that it was sustained. We did not drop the ball, say, here's a report, then go away.
Their persistence eventually led to an important briefing with President Jimmy Carter's science advisor, Frank Press.
Gordon briefed Frank Press and his staff. It's my understanding Press called the president of the National Academy of Sciences, Phil Handler, and asked him for a report on the state of the science. And Phil Handler then asked Jules Charney, who was the head of this geophysical fluid dynamics lab, to chair a National Academy panel. And that's how the briefing of Frank Press, thanks to his initiative, turned into a very important report.
Jules Charney was the father of modern meteorology and the study of climate. His team's report not only found that increased CO2 from fossil fuels would warm the planet, but also predicted a specific temperature range, conclusions that still stand today, some 4 decades later.
The basic outline of the problem was put there. Raise CO2, you're going to warm the planet, you're going to melt the ice sheets, you're going to have impacts on the weather, on drought, on extreme events.
That prediction has held, and everything else in the report has held to this day. And to this day, climate scientists will point to the Charney Report as the moment at which the fundamental science was established. In a certain sense, it's the end of the scientific story.
The report is followed by a flurry of actions across the government to try to figure out what to do about this massive problem.
And this culminates with a meeting that is called by a committee created within Congress by the Clean Air Act. At about 24 national experts. It's Rafe, it's a few politicians, it's economists, there's social theorists, political scientists. Henry Shaw, who leads the Exxon carbon dioxide research lab. The directive from Congress is to develop laws that could be passed that would help to solve climate change. And so Rafe and the others there feel like finally, now everyone in the room, including Henry Shaw, the Exxon, shares the basic understanding of the issue. They agree that emissions have to be reduced if we don't, civilizational chaos might ensue. And if you read the transcript of the meeting, their discussion of the problem feels like it could come from a meeting in Congress today. Completely sophisticated understanding of the nature of the problem, the kinds of solutions required, down to the possibility of, geoengineering and all kinds of radical new carbon scrubbing technology, understanding that the US was then the major emitter of CO2, but that wouldn't last for very long. They'd be surpassed by China. And so they understood there was a short window in which the US could lead on the issue. But when it gets time to actually writing legislative policy, it just falls apart. They cannot agree on a single detail. And Rafe is, for the first, but not unfortunately the last time, is disillusioned and has to go back to Washington and figure out, what can he possibly do next? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, 4 days later, Ronald Reagan wins the vote.
President of the United States.
The stark difference between the approaches of the environmentalist Jimmy Carter and his oil industry-backed successor, Ronald Reagan, is hard to overstate.
It's a total blitzkrieg on any kind of environmental regulation or policy. And so the CO2 issue is pushed onto the back burner.
Stymied by a president whose government refused to take action, Pomerance had to figure out a different approach.
You really need somebody who's going to stick with this. John Chafee, senator from Rhode Island, is having a meeting in like a week to decide on his environmental agenda. So I got Gus Speth, who was the president of World Resources Institute, my boss. We went, the two of us, to that meeting, and Speth convinced Chafee to do this, to do the climate issue. And Chafee, I remember, he said, yeah, I'll do it. That was a big moment.
Pomerance had found an ideal partner, a politician with a bullhorn loud enough to grab the public's attention. What they still hadn't found was the right message. Around this time, a team of chemists were making a disturbing discovery: a rapidly growing hole in the ozone layer caused by the release of harmful greenhouse gases called chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. Commonly used for cooling in air conditioners, freezers, and refrigerators, these gases were depleting a layer of the atmosphere, and their use was proliferating. This terrified people and was indisputable proof that human actions were causing rapid environmental damage on a planetary scale.
Joining the ozone depletion issue and the global warming question together turned into a very potent event. Because on the one hand, the members saw the data from NASA's satellite, which picked up the hole. But NASA had ignored because the results were so extreme, they thought there was something wrong with the satellite. So here you had this film of how human beings can alter the Earth's system. The hole in the Antarctic ozone was the size of North America, the largest hole there was.
Almost overnight, you have enormous amount of global anxiety. There's an image of the sun bursting through the atmosphere and basically irradiating everybody and everything on the planet. People are afraid of going blind, of getting terrible skin cancer, and a horror that this has been caused by human activities, and as ordinary an activity as refrigerating your food. This kickstarts this huge political effort that is unprecedented, a global partnership to try to solve the global environmental problem. It's the first time anything like this has been conceived of, let alone carried out. The final result of this is a treaty to reduce the use of CFCs. Over the years, the treaty is strengthened until it becomes a ban, and it's successful. It created a whole new momentum for CO2 because for the first time, there was a solution, a global treaty modeled after the Ozone Treaty. And so the success of that process led directly to the birth of the IPCC and the birth of this process that's still with us to negotiate a global treaty to solve climate change.
Bolstered by the world's quick action to tackle CFCs, Pomerance helped organize a hearing on a blistering summer day in 1988, featuring climate scientist James Hansen.
There was a huge press turnout because the heat of that summer was a dominant news story. There was historic droughts, wildfires all across the West and Yellowstone. And here was Hansen linking it to global warming and saying that this has arrived.
Drawing a straight line for the first time.
Hansen made the case that the global temperature had exited natural variability. In other words, you could not explain what the global average temperature was by natural variability. You couldn't push it that high.
He testifies, and it's one of the hottest days ever in Washington, D.C., and the press is insane. Top front page of the New York Times. He's on all the nightly news shows. He becomes overnight almost a global celebrity. And that's the moment when the issue really takes off. After that, you have 32 bills filed in that summer in Congress, climate bills, some of which are extremely far-reaching, bipartisan bills.
With the issue now on front pages across the country, Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, who had just captured the Republican Party's nomination for the presidential election that fall, decided to embrace the issue.
George H.W. Bush starts campaigning on the subject, saying that he's going to solve global warming.
Bush made a famous speech. One of the sentences was devoted to climate change. And he said, "Those who are worried about the greenhouse effect are ignoring the White House effect."
You also have the oil and gas industry beginning to take a closer look now at the issue. They start scrambling and trying to figure out, well, what should their public policy on this be?
With Bush's victory, it seemed a global agreement to limit CO2 was imminent.
One of the first actions of the new administration is to invite the IPCC's strategy group, the people who are going to write this new treaty, to have one of their first meetings at the State Department. And that meeting is held within a couple weeks of the inauguration. And James Baker, his first speech after being sworn in, gives the keystone address to this meeting and says, the Bush White House is glad you're here. We're happy to host this. The U.S. will provide leadership and we will solve this problem. And Bush continues to talk about it as well. He names William Riley, administrator of the EPA, and Riley is very strongly in favor of a CO2 treaty, talks about it when he's sworn in. So signs are good, but then of course, John Sununu is named chief of staff, and Sununu has other ideas.
Former New Hampshire Governor John Sununu had incredible influence over President Bush, because without him, Bush likely wouldn't be president.
Sununu, who's this very brash former governor who's credited with delivering the nomination to Bush after he uses the New Hampshire sort of Republican machine to help Bush win the primary after Bush had lost in Iowa and was being counted out. He's a savior, and that led Bush on a glide path to the nomination. Bush promised him any job he wanted.
Unfortunately, Sununu did not believe the scientific consensus and immediately used his powerful chief of staff position to seek out and kill any effort within the government to solve global warming. His first target was Secretary of State James Baker, who had just pledged to the IPCC team that the US would take the lead. He pretty much pulled Baker's leash right after that speech. Said, quote, "Leave the science to the scientists and stay clear of this greenhouse effect nonsense." And then Baker never speaks about it again.
Baker was Reagan's chief of staff. Baker is a widely, respected, serious statesman. It is striking to see the former chief of staff defer so quickly to Sununu.
With Baker sidelined, Sununu next needed to neutralize EPA Administrator William Riley.
There's this tug of war between Riley and Sununu. And it's almost like whoever Bush has spoken to last, or whoever figures out
familiar?
a way, right? Yeah, exactly. To write his speech, his language changes based on this. So there'll be one speech as if Riley is speaking, and there's another as if Sununu is speaking, and they go back and forth. At a certain point, Riley told me that Riley and Sununu came to Bush almost like squabbling siblings and said, "We don't agree. You have to be the tiebreaker on this." And Bush said, "Well, you all," and he included Baker in this too. Three of you, talk about it some more and figure it out, and then tell me, what you conclude. And Sununu had far more political power and sway than Riley, and he had the ear of Bush. So it was a real uphill battle.
Is it fair to say that Sununu is the first real climate denier?
I think it is safe to say that. I call Sununu patient zero of climate denialism. He's the first person, at least with any position of power or political connection, to insist that the conclusions are not justified by the science. And he has these conspiratorial theories that there's this cabal of leftist forces all over the world who like to use science to advance what he calls anti-capitalist ideology.
Despite Sununu's efforts at sabotage, a binding international agreement to limit greenhouse gas emissions was still being advanced by other pro-environmental forces in the Bush administration, working with members of Congress and the international community. Their work culminated in 1989, when foreign ministers from around the world gathered in the coastal Dutch town of Noordwijk to hammer out a binding agreement that would put the world on the path towards solving climate change.
This meeting was significant because it was the first meeting at which cabinet ministers from every major country would get together and try to express consensus about the general outlines of a global treaty. Riley, as the head of EPA, would be the U.S. representative, but Sununu, not trusting him to do what Sununu wanted on the global stage, insisted that Riley be accompanied by Bromley, the science advisor, as a babysitter. Bromley's presence was noticed by the other ministers at Noordwijk, and there was a general concern in the weeks leading up to the conference that Sununu was inserting himself and was trying to thwart what then seemed to be a general consensus on the terms of a binding agreement to reduce emissions across the world. So there was a lot of skepticism, but still hope that something serious would be done. To keep the pressure on the U.S. and to make sure that they stay in line, Rafe Pomerance and some other environmental activists that he's working with at the time go to Noordwijk on their own dime, stay at a funkier downmarket hotel near the Grand Hotel where this huge conference is happening. By the final meeting, it's the only meeting that's closed off to the public. And so the activists can only sit in the hallway while this final negotiation is taking place. However, the ministers, in order to use the bathroom, have to leave this ballroom and go down the hall where Pomerance and his friends are sitting, and they shout at each point, what's going on, what's happening? And no one will tell them. But as the meeting draws on over the course of the night and goes well beyond the expected duration of the negotiation, they start to get nervous. And finally, a Swedish minister comes out and Pomerance says, well, what's going on? What's going on? And he says, your government is fucking us up. And they realize that that is indeed what's happening. And when the ministers finally come out in the morning, vast majority of them are very disappointed and frustrated. It comes out that the U.S. has been able to bully, I believe, Japan, the UK, perhaps Russia, to not sign any agreement that pledges a hard target to reduce emissions. That at the time is seen as a huge disappointment and frustration and a real step backward. What's not understood then, and which can only be understood in retrospect, is that is the closest we've come to any kind of serious binding global treaty.
For the Bush administration, the big exit became when they would have to move from moving forward on basically a framework treaty, which they did, which was important. But when it came to making very clear-cut commitments to reducing emissions, that's where they departed.
I don't think that Bush ever really understood the science. It was not an issue that he cared about, wasn't a top priority for him. The reason that he spoke about it on the campaign trail, I was told, was because he was looking through a briefing booklet for a new issue to talk about to generate new headlines, I guess at a time when he felt the campaign had stalled. And he came upon this idea, a way to exploit a weakness of his opponent.
Bush had campaigned as an environmentalist to win the presidency, and he had strong bipartisan support from Congress to solve the issue. The missed opportunity during the Bush years is even more tragic considering how little opposition there was then from the fossil fuel industry. Of course, that didn't last long.
1988. There are a series of high-level meetings at the American Petroleum Institute and Exxon to try to figure out what the response should be. Essentially, the results are a couple of documents that were given to me by one of the authors. Position papers, basically. Most significantly, we will not back any policy that might affect the bottom line. And a sort of secondary measure taken by the American Petroleum Institute at the time is to start a kind of fake trade organization to try to start doing some lobbying. That's called the Global Climate Coalition. And what they do is they start looking for scientists whose conclusions support these arguments. And they find about 4 or 5 people, and they offer them $2,000 for each op-ed that's published. Not all of the scientists take the money. Soon enough, these scientists begin showing up in national articles all over the place. And for the first time, a subject that has essentially only had one side, which has been a story of alarm, has turned to an issue with 2 sides, where some scientists are saying that fears are overblown, the science isn't as solid as it seems, and you can see it in the press. There's so much of this press that Science, most esteemed scientific journal, runs an article that's sort of a meta-analysis of press around global warming. The question is, why all of a sudden are all of the headlines changing? And they find that it's just these 4 or 5 guys that are being quoted over and over again, not all of whom are really authority in climate science either. One's a soil scientist, one's a meteorologist. That's the first example of the kind of thing that says, that line about 99% of scientists agree. It's so successful that over the course of the 90s, this is how they end up spending most of their money. It's the best bang for their buck, basically, to the tune of tens of millions of dollars.
By the time President Clinton tried to solve the issue in 1993 with an energy, or BTU, tax, the PR and lobbying apparatus of the fossil fuel industry was more prepared to fight back.
The BTU tax is very closely related to a carbon tax. It had almost the same impact. If you tax coal, gas, or oil based on the BTU content, you get a price that looks like it was a carbon price. I believe it passed the House and was defeated in the Senate. But it had a couple of consequences, big ones. One is that the Republicans tended to use that vote against Democrats in the next congressional election. So Democrats lost a lot of seats, in part because of that vote. The other impact was that the loss of the BTU tax, that would have been a revolutionary breakthrough in the whole the whole climate change problem. Because the United States then would have had a real leadership position established in domestic law that allowed us to really commit to emission reductions.
Pomerance was serving in the State Department at the time, so he felt the sting of the defeat of the energy tax most acutely.
We were an important part of the U.S. negotiating.
How was that, being on the other side, sort of being on the government side?
Personally, very tough. If you're personally committed to getting the outcome, it can be very stressful.
16 years after Clinton's energy tax failed, President Obama took office. It seemed the US government might finally mandate emissions cuts. Its attempt was the Waxman-Markey cap-and-trade bill, which passed the US House, but ran headlong into a $700 million lobbying effort, spearheaded by Fortune 500 companies FedEx, Boeing, American Electric Power, Prudential, UPS, Marathon Oil, Duke Energy, Walmart, and Ford. The attacks were so effective at swaying senators that Majority Leader Harry Reid didn't even bring the bill up for a vote.
I think what was important is that behind the scenes, the denialist campaign was hard at work to make sure that nothing happened. And then there was the election, and the same similar thing happened 2 years into Clinton, happened 2 years into Obama.
Despite the failure of cap and trade, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, also known as the stimulus that Obama and the Democrats passed in 2009 in the wake of the last recession, actually did a lot to lower emissions.
Well, that package contained an enormous amount of money for renewable energy. And I think part of the reason that solar and wind are so commercially viable now was because of the amount of projects that were generated through the stimulus package.
They also did a lot of executive policy efforts to expand the Clean Air Act.
President Biden now in the White House and Democrats narrowly in control of Congress, the US government can take some action on climate change again. Still, measures that are bold enough to confront the true scale of the problem continue to be delayed.
The Republican Party they've melted a little bit, but They're still nowhere. And that means that we as a government can't do what we need to do. When the United States can't act, that slows the rest of the world. But on the other side of this, you see in California and New York, very advanced efforts at legislation to try to cut emissions, bring about new technologies, and so on.
Both Pomerance and Rich think history's judgment of anti-environmentalists like President Trump will be ruthless.
How as a president of the United States can you be hated by 50 billion people? There's only 8 billion people on Earth. Well, the reason is this is a multi-generational issue. So the billions of people to come are going to be living on a planet that is much hotter than it would otherwise have been. And part of the reason for that is Donald Trump.
History's judgment will be merciless. Once you look at the facts squarely, and once you understand the degree of human suffering that this is causing and would continue to cause in much greater extent in the years and decades ahead of us, anything that exacerbates the problem is inflicting violence and death, suffering on vast numbers of people, and perhaps many of them unborn. We all are guilty of consuming vast quantities of carbon.
You said your hands drip with crude, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's no way out of it. But the efforts to thwart progress and to sow public ignorance, that's where I think is the real horror. I think a important thing to understand or to emphasize with climate change is that it's not a binary outcome. There's not a victory or defeat. There's a huge range of outcomes still available to us, ranging from the not very good to the apocalyptic.
For the committed climate warrior, the work of convincing politicians to act goes on.
I've been a believer that Florida is pivotal, and I've been working with many colleagues down there to raise the visibility of the sea level rise issue in particular, as well as some other impacts, the intensification of hurricanes. The oceans are going to keep rising for a long time. And, Florida sees this blue sky flooding, king tide flooding now because of sea level rise. So it's begun. And the whole question has more visibility. And Florida votes, 50,000 votes here or there can flip the state. And Florida can really dictate, the voters, who the president of the United States is. It is a purple state with a huge number of electoral votes. So it is the most important political state in the country. And yet, in some ways, the most vulnerable, or clearly vulnerable to a warming planet. So the idea is to bring a convergence to those two facts by raising the issue of sea level rise in Florida so that it becomes what you might call a salient issue to voters.
Are you seeing when you talk to just...
Yeah, it's moving. It's moving. Yeah. One indicator is that the 3 largest papers of South Florida have formed a collaborative called the Invading Seas, where they identify sea level rise as the most important issue. I have a great team of people I work with down there. They're all in it. As I call it, a purple state impact strategy. And the other place is Arizona. You have heat, you have drought, you have fire. They're going to have big problems in Arizona.
In many ways, Rafe Pomerance's career is the story of the battle to solve climate change at the US government level. I'm grateful that he and Nathaniel Rich shared it with me here.
When I started in '79, the whole issue was nobody ever heard of it, essentially.
Wow.
People in Congress, people in the administration, the media, nobody knew anything about climate change. Seriously, zip. It's gone from nowhere to a huge global issue, as it should be. As it should be.
To gain access to the full-length episode, check out my membership site linked below. It has much more from this discussion, like how the Clinton and Obama administrations tried to solve the problem, how Trump's anti-environmentalism will be viewed by history, what justice will look like for those like him most responsible for causing runaway climate change, much more about Bush's climate denialist Chief of Staff John Sununu and his battles within the White House, a more in-depth look at the fossil fuel industry's efforts to prevent action, and what are the most effective ways to solve the difficult politics moving forward. If these conversations informed you as much as they did me, like this video and help it spread. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'm Bryce Plank.